Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your Cybersecurity Series. My name is Vlad, and I'm here to help you and support you in your cybersecurity journey, even if perhaps you don't have a technical background. Today, we are continuing our series on risk management, and we are going to focus more specifically on cyber risks. So, building upon what we have seen on the previous episode, we now know that a risk is a theoretical scenario that connects a hazard, which is a potential source of harm, and the notion of consequences. So, the harm that could happen to a person, an individual, or also organizations. And we know that these risks are measured with two components, two characteristics. The first one is the likelihood, so the probability that the risks materializes, and the impact, which is a measurement, it can be qualitative or quantitative, of the damage. And basically, the damage is a notion of anything that could go wrong or anything that would be adverse to the objectives of the organization. But the definition that we see here, it's really broad. It applies to pretty much any type of risks. It can be financial risks, strategic risks, operational risks, pretty much anything that you want. However, when we are in the context of cybersecurity, there is one key difference with this definition, and it is that we are no longer in presence of a hazard. Hazards, they are just there, they exist on their own. It can be a fire, it can be toxic chemicals. However, when we talk about cybersecurity, we rather talk about threats. And threats are meant to represent malicious actors. Those actors, they are voluntarily and deliberately trying to attack organizations or individuals. So we are talking about people, groups, even organized crime, with the intent and the capability of exploiting vulnerabilities and cause harm to people and organizations. So, when we will talk about a cyber risks, you need to understand that we are talking about the likelihood, or again, the probability, that a threat actor will successfully exploit a vulnerability on a specific asset or a group of assets, leading to negative consequences. So again, the cyber risk, it's the same thing as before. It connects the notion of threat to the notion of damage. And since we are in the context of cyber, the damage is going to be measured with regards to our three cybersecurity properties that you know from my very first episode: the confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And we are going to be looking only at that. Of course, if there are other damages like safety or injuries, this is not really within the realm of cybersecurity. That would be tackled by safety teams or quality teams or whoever you want. In cybersecurity, we will really focus on those three properties. So again, that's the main notion that we are going to see today. The cyber risks connect threats to damages with regards to CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. To give you some examples, those threat actors could be different. Of course, I'm giving you here three different examples. For example, first one, hacker wishing to steal data for profit, because you need to understand that since the threat is deliberate, they have an ulterior motive. So those people that are trying to breach into a company or harm your business, they have motives. Can be profit, can be sabotage, can be vengeance or revenge, can be pretty much different things, but they are doing it for a certain purpose. And that also is quite interesting because it can give us an advantage when we know them well and when we can understand what they are really looking after. So my first example is a hacker wishing to steal data for profit. So the risk would be a risk of data breach. And the damage or the consequence would be, for example, a loss of confidentiality on certain files. It could be also regulatory fines if you are in a regulated industry, like the banking industry, for example. And it could also be reputational damage if the clients, peers, partners, shareholders learn about this data theft. Second example could be a cyber criminal looking to paralyze a manufacturing company. There are different ways of doing that. One tool that the hackers like to use today would be the ransomware. I gave you some examples of real life scenarios in the previous episodes, if you go back to the chapter one. And the consequences could be business interruptions, financial loss, obviously, because you are no longer able to produce or ship the products, and data unavailability. Third and final example would be an insider, because you need to remember that threats are not only external, some of them can be and can come from your very own company or subcontractors or partners. So an insider misusing privileged accesses for sabotage. So the risk would be a risk on unauthorized access with the consequences of perhaps data theft, production stop, client trust erosion. Again, if the entire attack is made public and it kind of explodes on the market, anything can happen after that. So these are just three examples. When we talk about adversaries, so threat actors, I would like you to remember those six adversary archetypes that we talked about in episode 6. So if you want more details, please go back to the video and I will put the link on the top right corner of your screen. Basically, we talked about six of them: nation states, organized crime, activists, but also sometimes malicious competitors, insiders, and amateur hackers. There can be more depending on your source of information, but basically, those six archetypes are covering almost all possible sources of threats. And you will see more we go into the course that they have different motives, they have different tools, they have different techniques. And this is something we will insist upon in this chapter on risk management, because depending on who you are facing and depending on who you want to protect yourselves against, you are not going to implement the same level of security measures. If you are fighting against the NSA or a governmental organization, of course, it's not the same thing as fighting against insiders or fighting against amateur students who are just trying to penetrate or breach your systems for fun. So again, it's not going to be the same level of investment that you are going to put into your cybersecurity department. All of that to say that in the end, when we talk about a cyber risks, it's really at the crossroads, really in the middle of three different notions. The threat, so by threat we mean the threat actor that we just discussed; vulnerabilities, which is essentially a faulty mechanism, perhaps in an application, perhaps on a system. It's a door that is left open for the threat actors to use, and an asset. The notion of asset is absolutely important in cybersecurity risk management, because without this notion, you are not able to properly measure the consequences. So breaching a company, it goes through certain IT systems, can be a laptop from one of the employees, can be a server, can be many things, but you need to really understand what are the assets that are at stake and what is their inherent value for the company. Are those assets supporting businesses processes, or is this just an isolated laptop, for example? So the notion of consequence is really tied to the notion of asset. I'm also going to give you, and I will wrap on this slide, some ideas on why it's not so easy to measure cyber risks, and why we are going to invest several episodes throughout this chapter, so that you understand how we do it and what are certain pitfalls, what are the competencies that you can develop also to perform cyber risk assessments. So it's not so easy in terms of impact and likelihood, because those are the two components we are trying to evaluate, to assess pretty much every time we conduct a cyber risk assessment. The first one is that we are facing, again, adversaries, and those are not just hazards. So a fire can happen under certain circumstances, but here we are facing people who change their tactics constantly, they adapt, they rotate. For example, in 2015 or since 2015, ransomware is really popular. Before that, it was other means, other methods. So you need to always be always on your toes as a company, because things can happen. And the difficulty with assessing the impact is that we are severely lacking reliable data. Even if companies get breached every now and then, we are really struggling to measure properly what is the consequence in terms of financial impact, in terms of EBIT, or in terms of cash flow. So there are very few public statistics. Not all companies disclose that they have been breached. And of course, certain attacks remain hidden. There are some figures that come and go according to different studies. Some people talk about an average of 200 days that the hackers would be inside systems before launching their final attack. So I don't know if this figure of 200 days is reliable or not. However, there is this concept that sometimes hackers remain for very long periods of time, months or sometimes even years, studying the victims, studying the organizations, before finally extracting data or committing dangerous acts. All of that to say that assessing the impact, it's not easy. We sometimes need to take hypotheses, and sometimes we are, rather than measuring the risks impacts with a quantitative threshold, we are rather comparing risks one to another. So we rather say that this risk is more important than this one, rather than putting a quantitative figure and saying that these risks represent a risk of $1 million. So that's also something we will come back upon, but just to give you some perspective. And finally, there are also two other reasons or dimensions to keep in mind. The first one is that cyber attacks are context dependent. Basically, the same attack with the same threat actor, the same methods, are not going to produce the same results depending on the company. So if you have a group of hackers who are using ransomware, for example, as a mean, the impact on a public facing entity, a governmental entity, a hospital, a manufacturing company, or a small boutique is not going to be the same. So the impact also depends on the context, on the client organization, on their processes, which is why you cannot always say that a ransomware, I mean, computing the average loss after a ransomware attack, it's not something really practical to do because it really depends on the client and its own organizations. And finally, today, pretty much everything is interconnected. So even if one component falls in terms of confidentiality, integrity, or availability, sometimes it also has long term consequences on other systems that are interconnected. For example, if you are losing a production system, it's going to impact your entire production chain. Perhaps it's going to also put your subcontractors or suppliers in danger themselves financially, because if your production line is stopped, perhaps you are no longer ordering certain fragments or pieces to your suppliers. Perhaps you are no longer able to deliver clients who themselves are not able to deliver products. So it can have an impact, on the entire supply chain just because one company is impacted. And again, this is a concept that is not new. I gave you some examples before in chapter 1, so feel free to go back to that. But anyway, this is why overall it's not easy to assess likelihood. We are missing data, and it's not always easy to assess the impact because you need to dive further, discuss with the business, discuss with the impacted representatives to really understand what are the long term consequences also on the environment. That's it for today. I'm trying to keep it rather short, but I'm quite talkative. This is it. See you soon in the next episode. We will talk about adopting a risk based approach and why it's absolutely necessary today. See you soon. I hope you enjoyed. As always, I'm available in the comments. Feel free to reach out. Take care.